So, hi everybody, my name is Jen and welcome back to Law Hero. And we discussed the law, but we also discussed things around the law which makes better lawyers. And today we're talking about one of my favourite topics, which is memory. So do you think you have a good memory? Do you do anything to improve your memory? Would you like to make your memory better? These are questions I ask myself constantly, and I think that memory is essential to being a good lawyer, especially if you want to be able to recognize patterns. You have to have a memory of patterns you've seen before. So yeah, today we're going to talk about the phenomena that is memory. It's important for all of us, especially when taking exams, because we need to be able to remember mind mapping, concepts, case law, different legal sections that apply. Because in the FE1s, for example, in some of the exams, you have the benefit of bringing the legislation in with you. For example, criminal law and equity, you don't have any statute with you. So memory is still very important. It's not so important when you get to the professional exams, but you still need to know or remember how to navigate the books you've brought in with you. Okay, so we're going to start off first of all with Herman Ebbinghaus, who was one of the greats of memory studies. And so Ebbinghaus came up with the concept that 24 hours after learning something, we forget 2/3 of it. So I just want to take you right back to memory studies. So mnemonics, I can never pronounce that word, mnemonics, that has been a concept that has been around like since before Christ, and that was basically using like words or rhymes to remember things. So for example, I'm trying to think of one. Never eat shredded wheat, north, south, east, west. Those kind of things. I can't, again, like now that I need them, I can't remember them. I'll probably remember them afterwards. And yeah, so memory has been debated for centuries since then. Forgetting is most rapid in the first 9 hours of learning, and items forgotten can be relearned faster than new ones learned for the first time. So let me explain that again. Items forgotten can be relearned faster than new ones learned for the first time, and that's obviously because you've some kind of basis. So the next one is that meaningful things are remembered 10 times longer than random meaningless things. So for example, when you learn a PIN, like one of those verification codes that you need for like 30 seconds, you're never going to remember it again. But if what you've remembered has a profound impact on you, you're 10 times more likely to remember it. Repeated learning sessions over a longer interval of time improves memory retention on any subject. Just ask any Irish primary school teacher about that. Items towards the beginning and end of a series are most easily remembered. And material that is studied beyond mastery, which is overlearned, is remembered for longer. And that, in my opinion, is putting your learning into practice. Obviously, when you practice what you've learned, you retain it much, much better. Moving on in memory studies, the next psychologist we're going to cover is Bluma Zygonic, who is Russian. And so now let's look at her theory, which is interruption of a task greatly improves its chances of being remembered. And now this seems really counterintuitive, okay? So when she was at a restaurant, she noticed that the waiters could recall details of orders that were still not paid for better than orders that had been completed. This led Zygonic to wonder whether an unfinished task has a different status in memory and are remembered better than finished ones. She devised an experiment in which participants were given simple puzzles or tasks to do. They were interrupted during half these tasks, Later, when they were asked could they remember the activities, it became clear they were twice as likely to recall details of the uninterrupted tasks, whether they were ultimately completed or not. And this became known as the Zygonic Effect, which has important implications, especially for children. And this is because we retain more when we have frequent breaks in study. Little notice was taken of her ideas until the 1950s, and since then it's been accepted in the understanding of memory and as practical applications in education, but also in advertising and the media. Okay, so if we want to apply the Zygonic Effect to our own lives, I always harp on about memory, not only because of concentration, but now this is another source of knowledge that not only does breaks give the brain a rest and allows you to digest what you've just learned, it also increases your ability to remember it because you've been interrupted. The next psychologist we're going to move on to is a man called George Armitage Miller. So his theory is that the persistence with which this number plagues me is far more than a random accident. So what did he mean by that? So before information is stored in our long-term memory, it is processed by the working memory. Working memory has a limited capacity, and there's about 7 elements, and we'll go through them in a minute. If individual bits of information are organized into chunks of information, they are easier to store. Working memory can then hold 7 plus or minus 2 of these larger chunks of information. So what you basically do is by grouping elements, so like with like, you increase your working memory. And you will all know that this is the foundation of the Law Hero ebooks, that I am a stickler for grouping information, and if there are topics that overlap in linking them, I find this extremely important, and this is all to do with mind mapping. His famous article is The Magical Number 7 plus or minus 2, Some Limits on Our Capacity for Processing Information. So why was he so fascinated by the number 7? His method of measuring information and his idea of channel capacity, which is the amount of information which can be processed by a system, and then what he did was he applied that logic to the short-term memory. So basically he looked at our short-term memory as an information processor. This was when he began to be persecuted by the recurrence of the number 7. So the first instance of the magical number came from experiments to determine the span of absolute judgment, how accurately we can distinguish a number of different stimuli. In one experiment cited in his paper, they played a number of different musical tones participants who were then asked to assign a number to each tone. When up to around 7 different tones were played, the subject had no difficulty in accurately assigning numbers to them, but above 7 this reduced dramatically. So this is why the number 7 plagued George Armitage Miller, because it seemed 7 was the maximum number of topics the short-term memory could process at any one time. Okay, now we're going to move on to Elizabeth Loftus. So Elizabeth Loftus said that human remembering does not work like a videotape recorder or a movie camera. Okay. She basically thought that our ability to retrieve information from the memory is unreliable. And she said this was particularly true for traumatic events, because of our need to preserve ourselves, our survival instinct. So she wanted to look at eyewitness testimony, and this is extremely important for any litigators out there, and I'm particularly interested in this, as to how reliable eyewitness testimony is, especially if it's been a traumatic circumstances. So her experiment involved the following. So she showed participants different film clips of accidents, so road traffic accidents, and then she asked them questions on the accidents, and she asked them what they had seen, and she specifically asked the questions in a way that would influence their answers. So when they were asked to estimate the speed of the cars involved, the answer varied from whether the questioner had used the words bumped, collided, or smashed to describe the collision. They were also asked if there was any broken glass after the accidents, and the answers again correlated to the wording. So they're leading or closed-ended questions, which of course in court are prohibited. So there is also, like, that is a legal implication around leading witnesses. So it became clear to Loftus that recollection can be distorted by asking questions because you can plant misinformation in the question. So her theory then became, we believe that our recollection of a traumatic event is accurate. However, it may have been shaped by a leading question. It may have been suggested to us by someone we trust. It may have been altered by subsequent experiences. It may have been altered by our current emotional or idea state. But because of its emotional importance, we appear to remember it vividly. And then what we believe with all our hearts is not necessarily the truth, was the conclusion she came to. And this became known as the misinformation effect or false memory syndrome. And she concluded by saying that in real life, as well as in experiments, people can come to believe things that never really happened. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, or whatever you think you remember? The psychologist we're going to look to is Daniel Schachter. So we're nearly finished. So forgetting is an essential function of human memory, because if we retained in our short-term memory or our processing memory everything that we've come across, we're going to go crazy. We need to be able to dispel some of the things we've come across in order to make room for new experiences, and also to think fresh about things that have just happened to us. It's like a storage space on a computer. The process of retrieval can cause confusion of information, giving us distorted recollections, okay? So Schachter came up with the 7 sins of memory. We don't want a memory that is going to store every bit of experience. We will be overwhelmed with the clutter of useless trivia. So these are the 7 sins of memory according to Schachter. Okay, so they are divided into 3 different sections. So the first one is, sometimes we forget important things because of transience, which is like the passing of time. Absent-mindedness, we don't really need it, or our mind is somewhere else. Or blocking, as in we deliberately don't want to remember it. That's a bit like repressing those traumatic memories. And sometimes our memories become confused through misattribution, suggestibility, or bias. And then thirdly, we remember things we want to forget through persistence, which is learning new topics. So the sins of commission are more complex but no less common than the 7 sins of memory. So in misattribution, which is under our memories becoming confused, the information is recalled correctly, but the source of information is incorrectly recalled. It is similar in the effect to suggestibility, where recollections are influenced by the way in which they are recalled, for example, in response to a leading question. And I think that's what we spoke about previously. Bias also involves the distortion of recollection. This is when a person's opinions and feelings at the time of recalling an event colour its remembrance. And then the sin of persistence, which is when our brain wants us to forget something but we know we have to remember it, is an example of the memory working too well. This is when disturbing or upsetting information that has become stored in the memory becomes intrusively and persistently recalled, from minor embarrassments to extremely distressing memories. So a persistently bad memory, if you've had one, for example, through public speaking, this is a memory haunting you. And that is a sin of memory. You need to be able to control that. So my key takeaways from memory is that grouping words is the most, grouping concepts is the most effective way for memories to move from short-term to long-term memory. 7 is the magic number, or 6, depending on who you agree with. That memory can be influenced by suggestibility and persistence, but you can use persistence also in a positive light. And that you forget 2/3 of what you learned 10 hours after learning it, but it's much, much easier to have what you lost when you relearn it than learning information afresh. Those are my key takeaways. Definitely will approach memory differently, having learned from the great psychologists of memory studies. I hope you enjoyed this video.